Hello and welcome to ArcGIS Pro SDK for .NET, What's New in Editing. My name is Sean Jones. I am a product engineer on the Pro editing team, and with me is Narelle Chetzi, who is a developer on the Pro SDK team. Let's take a look at what we're going to cover today. We'll take a look at a mixture of what's new both in 2.6 and 2.7. Firstly, we'll take a look at snapping. We haven't really shown it much in previous sessions. We'll take a look at the overview of the editing environment and then this new functionality called layer snap modes. We'll then move on to enable editing, which gives us the ability to enable editing within the Pro application. And then we'll take a look at what's new in editing events, both what's new and also what has changed in 2.6 and 2.7. Let's start off with snapping. Now, snapping on the UI, as we all probably should know, can be found on the Edit tab, and here we have a large toggle button called Snapping, which basically turns snapping on and off for editing within every map in the project. There's a drop down underneath that, which then gives us the global snap modes: vertex, edge, end, point, etc. And these set the snap modes for every layer in every map in the project. Then underneath that we have the snapping settings dialog, which isn't shown here, but that gives us things like the XY tolerance, whether or not we can snap to the sketch, and that's done on a per map basis. To the right here's the supporting API, and all these methods and properties are hanging off a static class called snapping, which is available from the desktop mapping namespace. So at the top of this code we have the primary switch snapping is enabled. It's a boolean, true or false, basically turns on and off snapping for the project. Underneath that we can set the individual global snap modes. So we say set snapping, set snap mode, and then we can give it the snap mode, true or false, on or off. And then there's an alternate method to actually set multiples of these. At the bottom here we are setting the options, and we do that by getting the options firstly from the snapping class by providing a map parameter, set the tolerances, and then set it back using snapping.setOptions, the map, and then the options object that we retrieved. And that's a common sort of pattern in Pro. Okay, we can further refine snapping by saying what layers we want to snap to. So in the table of contents we have the list by snapping view and a bunch of checkboxes and layers, and here the checkboxes, rather than toggling the visibility, they're actually toggling the snappability of a layer. Some of the layers are disabled because we can't physically snap to them, things like annotation, base maps, imagery, things of that nature, so they won't have a checkbox. But we can simply turn them on and off and say whether or not we can actually snap to features in this layer. On the right hand side here we have an example where I'm going through each line feature layer in a map. I'm working out if it is currently not snappable. I'm using the property isSnappable to do that, and then I'm setting the snappability by using the layer.setSnappable method, true. And so that's just going to say, hey, this layer is snappable. It'll get ticked in the UI, and I can snap to it with any tools that honor snapping. Now, while this is fine to use this API in your custom tools that need to set up a snapping environment, if you do that, you might want to take a snapshot of the environment before you change it so you can actually set it back after you've used your tool. If you're just using the API to change the general snapping environment for Pro, you might want to consider looking at the tasks framework, because that gives us a no code solution where I can simply set up the visibility, the editability, and the snappability of layers, and it's a much easier way of doing it than actually setting code. Okay, so this API in the UI is old news, but we haven't covered it much in the past. Okay, let's take a look at what's new. So several users over the years and developers have asked for more finer control over the snap modes per layer. This is similar to the classic snapping environment that we find in ArcMap, where you could actually say, for this particular layer I want to snap to vertex, and for this other layer I don't want to snap it to a vertex. Now, So what we added at 2.6 is this concept of layer snap modes. Now this is API only, it's no UI control for it, so don't go looking for it in Pro. So let's take a look at how we get the snap modes for a layer. So on the snapping class we have another method called getLayerSnapModes, and we give it the layer parameter, and that gives us back a layer snap modes object. We can then query that object for the state of a particular snap mode. So here we're saying what's happening to vertex, what's happening to edge, what's happening to end. There's an alternate syntax down the bottom there where we can say from the object itself get the snap mode for this particular snap mode. And then that returns a boolean, of course. Now the initial values that we retrieve from the layer will be true, they'll be on, which means yes, I can snap to the vertex on this layer. And the reason why that is I'll explain a bit further on the next slide, but the initial value that you read, it will be true. And then you can change it. Now, how do we change it? Okay, to set layer snap modes, we use another method on the snapping class called setLayersSnapModes. Let's take a look at the code down the bottom of how we do this. So the top method there is we use the layer snap modes object that we retrieved from the previous slide, and we say set snap mode, we say vertex in this case, and we say false. I don't want to snap to vertices in this layer. And maybe I do want to snap to intersections, so I can say set snap mode intersections true. To set that back on the layer, I then use another method, or that method which you have on the screen there, set layer snap modes. Which layer we're dealing with, give it the layer snap modes object that we previously retrieved. So you retrieve it from the layer, change the snap modes, and then you set it back on the layer. To assign a single snap mode at once, I can use that syntax set layer snap modes layer vertex false. It's a bit easier than retrieving the object, just bypasses that. Or I can turn on all snap modes on, all snap modes off. So set layer snap modes layer true, set layer snap modes false. So there's a bunch of different ways that you can actually set these layer snap modes. Now, couple of caveats. With this information, you can actually start to build your own UI. Now we provide a sample in the community samples that actually shows you an example of this, and there's also some comments in the concept help as well. But Narelle's also going to show you a demo coming up. Now the caveats that I was talking to. A couple of things have to be on to see any effect. Obviously global snapping has to be on, so you want to be able to snap to something. The global snap mode must be on. So if I'm changing the availability of a vertex on a layer, I'm not going to see any result unless the global snap vertex is on, either under the UI or I've set it previously. And then lastly, common sense, the layer snapping has to be on for that layer, of course. So yes, I can snap to hydrants and I've turned on these individual snap modes. Other big caveat here is the layer snap modes do not persist. Okay, there's no sim model for it. They're not stored in the layer anywhere, which is why when we restart Pro and we look at the layer snap modes, that's why they're all true. We just assume they're all true at the start. So if this is something that you actually are building into UI, you must save these settings somewhere yourself. And we don't provide that in the example, but it wouldn't be hard to work out. Okay, with that, we'll now turn it over to Rel for a demo.
Thanks, Sean. Here I am in ArcGIS Pro with a very simple project. I have a number of point, line and polygon layers in my TOC, along with a random assortment of features that I've created in those layers. I have an add-in loaded that has a number of buttons here on the ribbon, which we'll be using in demos throughout these tech sessions. First button here, the Show Layer Snap Modes, launches a doc pane which has a UI configured to help me control layer snapping. The top half of the dialog has a number of buttons which we will use to investigate some code. The second half of the dialog is a UI that has all of the layers that are currently in my map, along with the values of the layer snap modes. Each layer has the same snap modes as the map snap modes. For simplicity's sake, I have just chosen to display vertex, edge and end, but the other snap modes also apply to each of the layers. So intersection, midpoint, tangent, and point snapping also apply. Before we get started, let's just review the UI within ArcGIS Pro that a user will interact with from a snapping point of view. We have the button down here on the status bar, which indicates whether snapping is on or off, along with the map snap values. Currently you can see that my snapping is off, but I have all of the map snap modes set to on. Second level of snapping is whether a layer is snappable itself. This is set up in the List by Snapping tab of the Contents pane. Each layer that supports snapping has a checkbox next to it, and the user can toggle this particular status on or off, and that defines whether a layer is snappable. The third level of snapping is the new layer snap modes. There is no UI in Pro for a user to be able to refine snapping to this particular level. Layer snap modes is API functionality only. So let's go ahead and examine this particular API. I am going to start by clicking this first button here to set up my snap environment just generally. And this should be very familiar code to you as it uses existing methods. We'll start by examining snapping. The snapping class is what we use to configure all of the snapping on and off and the snap modes. We can turn snapping on or off by using the isEnabled property. You can use the set snap mode function to set the value for a particular map snap mode. Say if I wanted to turn edge snapping on, I can use this particular method, set snap mode, to set a number of snap modes together. So if I wanted to say set snapping edge and end and vertex on at the same time in one function. New are these particular overloads, the set layer snap modes. So they allow me to refine the snapping to the layer level using any one of these different options, whether I want to do it for a particular layer in a particular snap mode, whether I want to set the snap modes for all of the snap modes for a single layer, or all of the snap modes for a set of layers, or anything other than that. We have a number of different overloads. We also have the get layer snap modes calls too, which allow you to retrieve the snap modes for a layer or a set of layers or all of the layers on the map. Let's return to the code. I'm going to turn my snapping on. I'm going to configure the map snap modes by starting off by turning them all off and then just turning point, vertex, edge and end on. Now I'm going to configure the layer snappability, and we do this by using an extension method on the layer. This needs to be called on the background thread, so I'm going to go ahead and jump once and then iterate through each of the layers calling set snappable to true. So you can see here in the UI, my snapping is being turned on. I have my first 4 snap modes set and all of my layers are snappable. As I digitize, you can see this here using snap tips. I have the vertex, edge, and end snapping on line 1, edge and end. Don't have any other vertices in line 2. You can see it also in my polygon layers as well. So now that I have my general snap mode set up, let's go ahead and try and refine this with the layer snap modes. By default, all of my layer snap modes are turned on. You can see this here in my UI, in my grid down here in the bottom of my doc pane. So perhaps I want to turn them all off all at once. So I'll click this second button and we can do this in 2 lines. Get all of my layers from the map and then call the set layer snap modes option, which takes a list of layers and a single Boolean value. this particular instance, this boolean is false. So I am setting all of my snap modes on the list of layers that I'm passing in, all of the layers that are in my map, to false. Once I've done that, I'm going to refresh the second half of my dialog by calling the populate snap list. Going to clear my existing collection, retrieve the list of layers, and then iterate through each of those layers, retrieving the snap modes for that particular layer. You can see that if I look at this, everything on this particular layer is false. As I mentioned, I am just looking at a subset in my UI, so I'm just setting it up into an internal class with the vertex, edge, and end values. We just iterate through the list, and we'll come back out, and you can see that all of my checkboxes have been cleared. If I go ahead and try and digitize, you can see that no particular snap tips and no snapping is occurring. Even though, again, still my map snap modes are still on, my snapping is still on, but because I have refined it at the layer snap level, nothing is snapping. Rather than turning everything on or off, I can actually choose to do things at a more minute level. In this instance, I want to turn vertex snapping on for the line 1 layer. So let's go ahead and look at this particular method. I have a couple of standard checks here. I've retrieved the layer from the map using the layer name that I selected. And now I'm going to create an instance of this new layer snap modes class. Let's have a look at the snap modes class. As I mentioned before, we have all of the different snap modes available: point, end, vertex, edge, midpoint, intersection, tangent. I have the ability to get a value of a particular snap mode, or set a value of a particular snap mode, or when I create, I can set them all false or set them to copy from an existing instance of that class. This particular example, I am setting everything to false, and then I'm going to set a single value to true, call a different version of the set layer snap modes class method, passing in a layer and the layer snap mode class, and then refresh my snapping list. So you can see my UI is refreshed. If I go ahead and digitize, I can get vertex snapping on line 1, but still nothing on line 2 or my polygon layers. Maybe I want to choose a different version of the set layer snap modes class method. So go ahead and click this particular checkbox. I want to set edge snapping on in line 2. You can see here we have a different instance where in this one I am taking a layer and a snap mode enumeration, single value of the enumeration, along with a boolean true or false. So again, set layer snap modes. This particular instance that's setting to true. If I go and digitize again, I still have vertex snapping on line 1. I now have edge snapping on line 2. Still nothing on my polygon layers, as you would expect. Setting them one by one is kind of slow. So here's a different method here, which we're going to illustrate, is how to set them using a set of layers all at once. So here, again, retrieve all of my layers from my map. I'm going to go ahead and set up a dictionary of the layer and layer snap modes. And I'm going to iterate through the first 4 layers of my map. This is my point layer. I'm going to get the layer snap modes from my point layer. Right now, all of these values are false. I'm going to turn this so that I have edge and end snapping on, and then add to my dictionary. Iterate again, second layer is my line 1. Retrieve the layer snap modes of line 1. You can see that I have vertex snapping on, which is what I had before. If But now I want to change that so that I have vertex and end on. Dictionary, third layer, here's my line 2. My existing values are edge. Now I want to change that. And my fourth layer, same thing, we'll do vertex and end. Add to my dictionary, jump out of my loop, and so now we call set layer snap modes with the dictionary of layers and layer snap modes. The second parameter here is false because I don't want to reset any of the other layers that are in my map. And then refresh my UI. So again, checkboxes are all refreshed. As I go digitizing, you can see that I have vertex on line 1 and end on line 1. I have edge on line 2, end on line 2. So around I also have vertex and end on my polygon 1 feature class, but still nothing on my polygon 2 because we didn't change those particular snap values, snap modes. So to recap, we have a number of new methods in the API to allow you to refine snapping at the layer level using the set layer snap modes. No UI available for users to do this refinement. And the other important thing to remember is that the layer snap modes are not preserved when you save the project. Every time you reopen the project, all the layer snap modes are set to true. Back to you, Sean.
Okay, let's take a look at enable editing. One of the design goals that we had in Pro was to have editing always enabled, such that to make an edit you simply grabbed one of the editing tools and performed the edit without having to worry about start and stop editing as we did in ArcMap. Now, while this is very convenient for editors, we found that non-editing people would accidentally make edits, such as selecting a feature and hitting the delete key, or more commonly making an accidental edit in the layer attributes table. So to help prevent this, we added a new control at 2.6 which enables and disables editing. Now if you have Pro 2.6, you might be wondering where this control is, and the trick is it's not on the UI by default, you have to add it from a backstage option. So to add this control, we go to the project options, we come down to the editing group on the left, and on the right we go down to the session group and then check enable and disable editing from the edit tab. Once that's done, the edit control button is added to the edit tab in the UI. Now this is off by default, and when it's off, all the editing controls are disabled. Now it's pretty hard to make an accidental edit if you can't use the control. Once that's turned on, you can then simply make all the edits that you want because all the controls are available to you. Now if I'm making some edits and I come back to this control and I haven't saved those edits and I come back to this control and I turn it off, it's going to prompt a UI for me to say, what do you want to do with these outstanding edits? Save, discard, or cancel. The same thing happens if the control's there and you also remove it from the backstage. So you have to decide at that point, what are you going to do with these outstanding edits? Easy enough. Okay, let's take a look at it from the API perspective. To get the state of editing enabled in the project, we can look at is editing enabled Boolean property under the current project, and this just reports true or false. Now, assuming you haven't touched this control, added it to the UI, this is always going to report true because editing is always enabled by default. That'll only say false if somebody has added it to the UI and turned it off, or its default status it's off, the control, or I've set it programmatically. Now to set editing enabled programmatically, I can say, or use the method set is editing enabled async Boolean on the current project, and this will be true or false. Now if you're going to set this to false, there's a couple of things that you need to think about as a developer. Now remember, if I set it to false, then if there's any outstanding edits, by default I'm going to come up with a default UI which says do you want to save or discard these edits. That's fine to perfectly do that if you want. Alternatively, before you set it to false, you can also check to see if the project has edits, and then you can decide whether you're going to save those or discard those automatically, or you may want to prompt the user with your own particular dialog. So in this code down the bottom, that's what we're actually doing. We're saying, hey, does the project have any outstanding edits, by using current.hasEdits. Then we pop our own message dialog and ask the user what they want to do. If they say save edits, then we call save edits. If they say no, then we discard, etc. And then finally at the end we say set is editing enabled async to false, which will disable editing in the UI and also for the API. So let's take a look at how this actually affects the edit operation. Now, if editing enabled is false, edit operation.execute will fail. So the add-in will still actually run, but execute will return false. Edit operation.is succeeded will return false, and edit operation.error message should report that editing has been disabled. So if your control is available, this is what will happen if editing is been disabled. Now, ideally what you want to do is disable your control according to the state of editing enabled, like we do for all the other core editing tools. One way to do that is to set a condition on the control itself, and there's two conditions that we make available. One is the editing possible condition, which is a generic editing enabled condition. And then when editing is disabled, your control will become disabled as well. The other condition to use is editing map condition. This is specifically for use with map tools in a 2D map. We use it for some of our tools, but if that's a control that you have developed for use in a map tool in a 2D map, then you might want to use the editing map condition there. If you haven't had much experience with setting conditions in controls, they're set on the DAML. And on the right hand side there we can see that the condition line's just been highlighted, and I've just used the Esri editing map condition. And again, once editing has been disabled in the UI or through the API, then my control will be disabled as well. Okay, let's take a look at a demo.
Back in ArcGIS Pro, I am using the same project and the same add-in. You can see here in the Modify Features pane, I have two custom tools that I've added into their own group. These tools also exist in my add-in ribbon, along with two buttons that are part of my editing group, which we'll be illustrating in this demo. I'm going to go to the Backstage options, and I am going to turn on Enable and Disable Editing from the Edit tab. Once this is set, we can see how Pro responds. The Modify Features pane, all of the application tools are disabled. We have a ribbon across the top telling a user to enable editing in order to show the tools. We look at the Edit tab, we can see that the gallery is also disabled, and we have this new Edit tool to allow users to enable editing. But you will have noticed that one of my tools is still enabled. Now this particular tool wraps around an edit operation, so it really shouldn't be enabled when editing currently isn't active. So how are these two tools defined and why are they different? Let's go ahead and look at the DAML definition of these tools. Here is my default tool. You can see that the condition on this particular tool is the Esri _mapping_map pane condition. This is the default condition that the Visual Studio template assigns to a map tool definition. But here is the definition for my editing tool. We can see that the condition here is the Esri _editing map condition. This condition incorporates the check for editing being enabled. And this is why my editing tool is disabled correctly, but the default map tool is still enabled because its condition is map pane, which I currently have a map pane open. So what happens with this particular tool, which happens to wrap an edit operation, what happens to that particular tool when editing is not currently enabled? Let's go ahead and find out. I'm going to activate the tool and click out on the map, drawing a rectangle. And it's a very simple tool. It really just retrieves the features under my cursor update an attribute on the features found there. So I've basically looked to the features to see whether they contain the layer that I'm interested in, which happens to be the line 2 layer. I've set up a dictionary of attributes. I'm adding the updated by field and passing in the current username. I'm going to set up an edit operation, assign a name to that edit operation, iterate through all of the features on my line 2 layer that intersect my sketch geometry, call the edit operation.modify, passing in the layer, the OID, and the updated attributes, call execute, and I am also checking the error message. When I take a look at this, I can see that the operation.execute returns false, and the message is that my edit operation failed because editing is not currently enabled in the application. If I F5 that, we will just surface that to the user in a message box. So, as you can see, edit operation.execute and edit operation.execute async is going to fail when I am currently not editing. And remember, it doesn't throw an exception, it actually just returns a false value. So it's really important that as a developer, you check the return value of execute or execute async, and also, if it fails, to check what the error message is. So, how do I enable editing? Well, here's my button for enable editing. And you can see that when I click it, first off, we're going to check whether editing is currently enabled in the project. It's not. It returns value of false. I'm going to ask a message to the user. Would you like to enable editing? Yes. And then all I need to do is call the set is editing enabled async with a value of true. Once I've done that, you can see that all of the application tools have been enabled. My editing tool, because it checks for that condition, has also been enabled. So now I can go ahead and again drag a rectangle on the map, come back to my default map tool and run through the same thing again, updating the attributes, creating the edit operation, assigning a name, calling modify, calling execute. This time my execute succeeded. But I might also be interested in disable editing to clean up and to make sure that all of my edits have been saved. So here's my disable editing button. Again, check whether I'm editing enabled. It's true. Ask the user. Check whether I've got any edits because I need to save or discard those edits before I change the editing enabled state. Again, check with the user. And in this particular instance, I want to say yes, I'm interested in saving the edits. And then I want to set editing enabled to false. Once I've gone ahead and done that, the UI responds accordingly. All of the application tools are disabled. My editing tool is disabled. Unfortunately, my default map tool is still enabled because I have the wrong condition. Back to you, Sean.
Okay, let's take a look at edit events. We have added a new event, edit started event, and we have modified an existing event, edit completing event. Let's take a look at the first one. So edit started event is new, and this fires when an edit operation is starting to execute. So in your add-in you have a whole pile of code, and somewhere in there you have edit operation.execute. As soon as that line gets hit, then this event gets fired. This event is useful for initializing other objects in your add-in, certainly variables, but also other objects under your control. This is not the place to create edit operations or to execute those operations. Bad things will happen, so don't do that. Next up is the edit completing event. As a reminder, this fires when the edit operation is completing. So the edit operation has done its thing, it's made all its edits, and it's about to return true or false to the execute. This is when this method gets run. What we have added here is the edit operation itself is passed through to edit completing event args. What this allows you to do is take that edit operation and add additional edits by supplying it with more methods. As an example, say you're creating a feature and you want to write out to a different table, you could do it during this event. Now the event is also cancelable just by the cancel edit, and the whole edit will stop at that point. Edit completed event is not new, but we just included it here for the flow. So edit operation.execute, edit started the event will fire and do its thing, then edit completing will fire just as that execute is about to return. Once they've all processed and assuming they're all correct, then edit completed event will fire and give you the opportunity to look at what's actually changed during that edit. Keep in mind that actually listening to things like row events, that will actually occur between the started and the completing, and the row events will do their own thing as well. Okay, so let's take a look at this in action.
Back in Pro, I have a final button on my Add-in tab, which launches a doc pane to allow me to listen to the edit events. I have a couple of checkboxes which I Back in Pro, I have a final button on my Add-in tab which launches a doc pane to listen to the edit events. I have a couple of checkboxes to allow me to control various actions for the edit completing event that we'll examine in this demo. Let's start by listening to the events. As you can see in this code, I'm subscribing to all the row events for all the layers in my map. Here I've retrieved all the layers in my map. I've jumped to the background thread, and now I'm iterating through all of the layers, retrieving the feature class, and subscribing to the row created, the row changed, and the row deleted event. I'm also subscribing to the edit started, the edit completing, and the edit completed event. As I digitize a new polygon, we can see the order of the events in my doc pane. First, I have an edit started event, then a row created event, an edit completing event, and finally the edit completed event. If I go ahead and divide the new polygon in two using the divide tool, I can see that I get a single edit started event followed by a number of row events, a single edit completing event, and then again a single edit completed event. Let's take a closer look at the new changes to the edit completing event. I'll go ahead and choose this first checkbox to cancel the edits, and I'll divide the polygon again. Here I am in my edit completing event. My cancel edits flag is true, and I'm choosing to cancel the edits using one of the cancel edit overloads of the edit completing event args object. I get an error message, and the divide tool recognizes that the edit failed by showing the error banner. As you would expect, I don't see any new item added to the undo operation either. Looking at my log, you can see I have edit started, my two row events, and the edit completing event, but no edit completed event because my edit didn't actually complete. Next is the new ability to add items to the operation within the edit completing event. I'll check the audit records control and try the divide again. This time I'll come down to a different if statement, my add audit record. I have a method here, add change, which will use the operation of the event args. It's going to find me a table in my TOC, add a number of attribute values, and then use the edit operation.create method to add a new record to my history layer. I also have an extra create function here, simply to illustrate another concept. Here I'm going to be adding a new point feature using the exact same thing, edit operation.create. And I'm choosing to do this because I know that I have subscribed to the row created event on my point layer. Now, when I look at the doc pane, you can see that I have the edit started, I have the row created and row changed from the divide operation, followed by my edit completing event. Because I created a new feature in the point layer, I also see a row created event. If I had subscribed to the row created event on the change history table, I would have received a notification for that too. So you can see that you can still receive row events for operations that are added within the edit completing. However, just as there is a single edit started event and a single edit completed event, there is only a single edit completing event, which happens as soon as you call execute. But because you have done things within edit completing, you can also have row events interleaved in between. Back to you, Sean.
Okay, so to wrap up this What's New session, we talked about snapping, a bit of the environment plus the new layer snap modes. We talked about enable editing and how that affects you as a developer through the API. And then we looked at the new and modified edit events. Now the code and the slides that we used today are available on our GitHub page. Here's the link, and also if you have your camera handy, you can also take the QR code to take you to the same location. I'll just leave this up for a few seconds so you can capture that. Additionally, we have the Pro SDK page on our GitHub. We also have the editing concepts page, which covers a lot of the fundamentals of editing in the API, together with some small code snippets. And you can find the SDK community samples at that bottom link, where we have a number of growing editor samples there, which can help you in your development. Please provide feedback for the session by clicking on the link below. And we thank you very much for your time today.